Hi, thanks for joining me today in another episode in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, if you've been with me since the beginning, we've come to the ninth episode in our study and finally have arrived at the conclusion of the fifth chapter. While that's good as we're making progress, I must warn you that the conclusion of Matthew chapter 5 in verses 38 to 48 may represent the most challenging part of what Jesus has said to this point in his sermon. In this text, Jesus, again, he calls to mind the misrepresentations, the misinterpretations of the old law and dealing with what people thought it meant and how it applied and how it was being presently used in the time of Jesus. In Matthew 5 and verse 38, Jesus says that you've heard it said by them of old time, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, do not resist one who is evil. Now, what does Jesus mean by that? What a challenging statement for him to make. Then, if that wasn't challenging enough, in verses 43 and 44, he says that you've heard it said by them of old time, thou shalt love thy neighbor, but hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, to love your enemy, to bless them that curse you, to do good to them that hate you, and to pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Now, again, this is deeply challenging commands of Jesus in this part of the sermon. What he seems to be doing is partly he's correcting these misinterpretations of the old law. The old law dealt with how one was to respond to someone who'd harmed them. Particularly, it was a law, and the law allowed for accusations and charges to be brought against someone who'd committed a crime. And what the old law did was, and this is generally what any law does in society, it removes from the hands of a victim the right for retribution. It removes their right for retribution, and it places that in the hands of a legal system, in the hands of judges. Judges were to hear cases. Judges were to decide the guilt or innocence of the accused. And if one was found guilty, the judges applied the law and prescribed a punishment. It did not allow victims to decide punishment. And it was the law in Deuteronomy chapter 19, for example, was designed to prevent victims from exacting excessive punishment. And of course, it prohibited vigilante justice from someone who'd been wronged or who had been hurt. But though this teaching is relatable, because we have people who will mistreat us from time to time. When we're little children, we first experience maybe a bully on the playground, someone calling us names, and there's this reaction that we have to try to give it back to them or to get even. And those feelings and impulses continue with us into adulthood. Jesus is trying to renew our minds, to renew our thinking, to change our attitudes and behaviors and how we respond to even our enemies. How do we respond to teaching that challenges us when it comes to Jesus and his word? Well, perhaps one response is to try to diminish the full force of what he says. Maybe we will try to redefine things or somehow or another soften the thrust of what he says. One method of trying to soften the teaching of Jesus sometimes is to compartmentalize what he says. Let me explain what I mean by that. Jesus' teaching in this section of the sermon is about how we're to exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. And we do this through certain moral and ethical behavior. But when it comes to issues of morality and ethics, we often have multiple standards for ourselves. There might be a way that an ethical standard that we will use regarding our family life. There may be an ethical standard that we will apply when we're at the office, at work, in business. Perhaps we will treat those in the business world rather harshly or callously, in a way that we would never treat our own family. When it comes to the teaching of Jesus, we may do very similar kinds of things. For example, with reference to how we are to respond to our enemies, some have said, well, there are spiritual enemies and there are physical enemies. Regarding our spiritual enemies, perhaps someone who would try to persecute us for our faith, well, we are supposed to respond in a certain kind of way. But if it regards our physical enemies, well, we can just do whatever we want. Jesus in his teaching makes no such distinctions. He doesn't offer multiple ethical standards. Instead, he offers one way of living. We're to treat our fellow man in the same kind of fashion in every context in which we find ourselves. And if you haven't caught on yet to this in this sermon, the ethical code of the kingdom is love. It is self-giving, sacrificial, unconditional love that is supposed to be applied to our neighbor, to our fellow man. The kind of love that God expects us to use in the treatment of others is the kind of love that he has used with reference to how he has treated the human family. His love is self-giving. His love is that of mercy that has been extended to enemies. As Jesus even mentions in this section, he says that God causes the rain to fall on both the just and the unjust. He doesn't bless one group and not another. Instead, he extends his blessings to all in the hopes, with the intentions, that all will respond in love to him. Now, regarding not restraining, he says, do not restrain evil. Do not restrain an evil person. That does not mean that we cannot restrain evil within others. For example, Jesus, if we could not just restrain evil in others, then that would prohibit us from even rebuking sin in the lives of other people. Jesus often rebuked. He rebukes the Pharisees, for example, in this text. So we certainly can offer words of rebuke. Additionally, we can appeal to governments to restrain evil and to pursue justice. That certainly is within the realm of our liberty as God's children. What Jesus is getting at is how we go about restraining evil with others. What is our intention in restraining evil? We cannot restrain evil in others with vengeful retribution in our hearts. That cannot be what is driving and motivating our actions. Paul would later apply some of these principles of the Sermon on the Mount and some of the things that he wrote in Romans chapter 12, as he begins in Romans 12 talking about how we're to renew our minds. If we're going to renew our minds by the mercies of God that have been poured into our lives through the Messiah, then that's going to cause us to love our enemies, to do good to those who harm us, to pray for those who harm us. And that's what Jesus is driving at here. We're not to respond to evil with evil. Evil is not blunted. Evil is not deterred. Evil is not stopped by more evil. That is often, though, how we approach evil. We respond to evil with evil, and that's not how God wants us to approach it. Instead, he wants us to approach evil with self-giving love. Love is the means by which evil is blunted and stopped. Which brings us to the next point that Jesus makes in this sermon, that we're to love our enemies. Jesus does not want us to give our enemies what they deserve, and that so often is what we attempt to do in our lives. When someone has wronged us, we want to give them what we think they deserve. That's not how God has treated us through the sending of Jesus. God has not given us what we deserve as sinners. Rather, God has extended mercy to us through Jesus. That's what those who are evil need. They need the mercy of God to be extended to them. And if we are the people of God, then our kingdom work is going to involve us seeking to offer mercy to even our enemies in the hopes that we can make family out of our enemies. Kingdom work is difficult and challenging, deeply difficult and challenging. that we would try to seek to make family out of our enemies is not the natural way we think. In conclusion, I'll bring to mind an example of what we're talking about here. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus was with the apostles, and they were going about their work, and James and John went into Samaria to try to make plans for Jesus and the apostles to stay the night. They returned to Jesus from Samaria and told Jesus essentially the Samaritans did not want them to stay there. A lot of that, of course, had to do with the ethnic hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. James and John, in a fit of self-righteous anger and indignation, asked Jesus if they should call down fire from heaven to wipe the Samaritans off the face of the earth. Jesus stopped James and John and rebuked them. And he said that they did not know the spirit that was in them in making such a request. Instead, Jesus tells them that he did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Yes, Jesus came to save even the Samaritans who at that very moment in time were rejecting him. That was quite a lesson, no doubt, for James and John, quite a powerful lesson that ought to resonate in our minds today as Jesus challenges us to love through the extension of mercy even to our enemies. I appreciate you listening today. I hope the lesson has been helpful. In our next episode, we will get into the 6th chapter and notice some more teaching in this most transformative Sermon on the Mount. Thank you and have a nice day.